The countryside had always carried a certain kind of silence, not the empty silence of forgot towns, but the living quiet that came from open fields, grazing cattle and wind that moved through the trees like an old storyteller. For decades the West Ridge had been guarded by a single oak, a century-old giant whose roots dug so deep into the earth that storms bent around it like a respectful bow. Most locals viewed the tree as a landmark, a memory, and a witness to the passing of generations. But to one newcomer, a wealthy outsider named Valerie Stone, it was nothing but an inconvenience. Valerie arrived in the valley with the arrogance of someone used to getting her way. Her home, a modern glass monstrosity perched on the hill, was built with the singular purpose of displaying sunsets as though nature itself were part of her curated decor. She came with money, with attitude, and with a sense of superiority that seeped into every conversation she had with the locals. She believed that anything standing in her way, literal or figurative, should simply move. This included the oak tree. For years, the property had belonged to a man named Cole Harrington, a former K-9 officer and retired sheriff's deputy. Cole lived in a modest log home that sat at the base of the ridge. He was respected, quietly feared, and universally known as a man who didn't break easily. His dog, Ranger, an aging yet sharply intelligent German shepherd, remained his closest companion. Together they kept to themselves, working the land and minding their own business until Valerie arrived. Valerie first noticed the oak tree on the day she toured the land before purchasing her home. The realtor had praised the breathtaking panorama, but Valerie's eyes narrowed at the tall silhouette rising on the neighboring property. She said nothing at the time, but a quiet irritation sparked, waiting for fuel. It didn't take long for that spark to grow into a fire. When she moved in, her evening routine became predictable, standing on her deck, wine glass in hand, watching the sky bleed into shades of orange and gold. She believed the sunset was an element that belonged to her now. But as summer approached and the sun drifted lower in the sky, the oak's tall branches began to stretch across her line of sight. To her, it felt intentional, as though nature were mocking her. That's when the complaints began. First, they arrived as letters slipped into Cole's mailbox, handwritten notes dripping with passive aggression. Valerie insisted the tree was invasive, damaging her property value, and obstructing a natural resource she deserved to enjoy. Cole read each letter with the same expressionless calm, sliding them into a drawer without response. He knew the type. He had encountered many during his years in law enforcement, people who believed the world revolved around their desires. Over the next weeks, Valerie escalated. She contacted the county office demanding an evaluation of Cole's property for environmental violations. Inspectors came, walked the land, admired the oak, and left amused by the absurdity. She then attempted bribery, offering to pay Cole for just a trim, insisting it would be mutually beneficial. Cole didn't say a word. Silence to him was often the strongest answer. But Valerie was not someone who accepted silence. Her frustration grew into fury when she discovered the tree was older than she'd guessed, protected under local historical preservation ordinances. Cutting it down without permits could result in massive fines or even criminal charges. This did not stop her. Instead, it pushed her to pursue underhanded ways to get what she wanted. What Valerie didn't realize was that while she watched the horizon, Cole was watching her. He had learned long ago to study threats before confronting them. And Valerie, with her entitled behavior, carried all the signs of someone who would push boundaries until they snapped. Cole began documenting everything: unusual cars parked near their property line, suspicious pathways forming through the brush between their homes, and unfamiliar footprints near the base of the oak. Ranger detected it first, growling softly whenever the wind carried her perfume-like scent. Something was brewing, and Cole knew she wouldn't stop until she forced a conflict. The incident that marked the beginning of open war occurred on a quiet evening when the valley was wrapped in heavy clouds. Without the sun, the oak cast an even darker shadow across Valerie's field of view. Witnesses later recalled seeing her packing on her deck, wine spilling over the rim of her glass as she gestured toward the tree as if it were an enemy soldier. What happened next became the spark that ignited everything. Sometime after midnight, when the valley slept under a blanket of fog, Valerie stepped into the night with an axe. Her designer boots crunched against the gravel as she crossed the property line without hesitation. Her mind, clouded by wine and self-righteous anger, saw only one obstacle between herself and the perfect sunset. Under the cloak of darkness, she approached the base of the ancient oak and lifted the axe. But she didn't know that Cole had expected this. For weeks he had been preparing, not in hostility but in protection. He had installed motion-triggered lights, hidden trail cameras, and pressure alarms around the tree, weaving a silent defense system born from years of tactical experience. And as Valerie swung the axe for the first time, the valley lit up like a flash of lightning. A burst of white light exploded from the ground, illuminating her like an actor caught on stage. The cameras snapped photo after photo, documenting everything with perfect clarity. Ranger, sleeping lightly at Cole's door, erupted into barks that tore through the silence. Valerie, startled and disoriented, stumbled backward, dropping the axe as the alarms echoed deep into the night. Cole stepped onto his porch with the calm, steady posture of someone who had seen danger 1,000 times before. He didn't need to confront her. He didn't need to say a single word. The cameras had captured all the evidence he needed. Valerie fled into the darkness, humiliated, believing she had escaped. But she didn't know the truth. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Everything she had done, every trespass, every attempt to manipulate the system, every midnight attack had just turned into ammunition Cole would use in a way she would never see coming. As the last alarm died into the night and Ranger settled beside him, Cole stared at the oak tree rising proudly against the sky. The battle she had started was now in his hands, and the next move would be his, strategic, calculated, and devastating. The war for the sunset had begun. Dawn broke slowly over the valley, washing the fields in soft gold, but the peaceful glow did nothing to quiet the storm brewing beneath the calm surface. The oak tree stood unbothered, its bark carrying a faint new scar from Valerie's midnight strike. Cole examined it with a steady expression, his fingertips brushing the indentation where her axe had connected. The damage was superficial, but the intent behind it was not. Lines had been crossed, boundaries shattered, and now the coming days would determine how far Valerie was willing to go and how far he would have to push back. Cole spent the morning reviewing the footage from all 8 trail cameras hidden around the property. Each clip was crystal clear. Valerie had not only trespassed, she had attempted to destroy a protected landmark. Her posture, her expression, the wild desperation in her movements, it all revealed a side of her the valley hadn't yet witnessed. But cameras captured more than just her actions. They captured her certainty. She genuinely believed she would get away with it. Ranger lay at Cole's feet, ears perked, eyes scanning the room as if sensing the tension in the air. Cole paused the footage, leaned back and exhaled. He had seen people like Valerie before, people who convinced themselves that rules existed to control others, not themselves. People who believed wealth could erase consequences. But he also knew something Valerie did not. In the countryside, land had memory, and so did the people who protected it. By midday, the valley was buzzing with quiet whispers. The alarms in the night had been heard by anyone within a mile radius. Neighbors called one another, wondering what could have triggered such a commotion. They knew better than to meddle in Cole's affairs, but they also knew trouble rarely made it past his property line unnoticed. Valerie, on the other hand, spent her morning hiding behind dark sunglasses, packing on her glossy wooden deck, replaying the night in her mind. Shame mixed with fear. Her hands trembled as she held her coffee cup, flashes of the blinding light and barking dog interrupting every attempt she made to calm herself. She hadn't expected a trap, she hadn't expected surveillance, and worst of all, she hadn't expected to leave evidence behind. A single glove was missing from her set. She didn't know it yet, but that glove lay at the base of the oak, recorded in multiple angles, imprinted with her perfume and marked with traces of the soil only found on her side of the ridge. It wasn't just a clue, it was damning. Cole didn't rush to confront her. Patience was his greatest advantage. People in panic always revealed their next move if given enough time, so he watched from afar as Valerie's behavior shifted throughout the day. She kept glancing toward the tree, toward the cameras she didn't know existed, toward the shadows that seemed suddenly hostile to her. The arrogance she wore like perfume had thinned, replaced with paranoia. She knew she'd been seen, but she didn't know how much had been captured, and that uncertainty drove her deeper into desperation. As the sun climbed higher, Cole began assembling the next phase of his response. Not revenge, not yet. First came exposure. Truth had a way of dismantling people like Valerie when presented with irrefutable weight. He charged batteries for his drones, checked the time stamps on every recording, tested Ranger's tracking harness, and organized the evidence into a timeline. Every step was precise, controlled. He knew that to bring someone like Valerie down, he had to stay 10 moves ahead. Meanwhile, Valerie made her own plans. Just before noon, she drove into town, her luxury SUV kicking up dust as she sped down the gravel road. She carried herself with forced confidence as though the previous night had never happened. But her eyes darted toward every passing neighbor, searching for any hint that they knew. She marched into the county office with a folder of fabricated complaints, determined to turn the situation before it turned on her. She claimed Cole's oak tree was a hazard. She claimed its roots were causing erosion, even though the land had been stable for a century. She claimed it was lowering her property value, affecting her mental health, casting shadows that triggered migraines, and attracting wild animals that threatened her safety. It was an avalanche of exaggerations, each more ridiculous than the last. But officials in the valley weren't naive. They listened, nodded politely, and filed the complaints away, not out of agreement, but because they'd already received word earlier that morning that something unusual had happened on Cole's land. They knew Cole, they knew his history, they knew his commitment to evidence. So when Valerie stormed out, believing she had laid the groundwork to manipulate the system, the officials simply contacted Cole with a simple message: "If something happened, we're ready to see your side." Cole smiled for the first time that day. By late afternoon, the air grew heavier, charged with a tension the valley could almost feel. Cole launched his first drone, sending it soaring above the ridge to map the exact route Valerie had taken during the night. The drone glided silently, its camera capturing footprints, tire tracks, and broken branches along her trail. When combined with the timestamps from the trail cameras, the evidence formed a perfectly clear narrative. Ranger followed the drone's observations with instinctual precision, nose to the ground, tracking the faint traces of Valerie's scent through the brush. Every path she had taken, every step she had scrambled in the dark, became a trail of breadcrumbs leading directly back to her home. The investigation wasn't just methodical, it was surgical. Cole wasn't preparing to accuse her. He was preparing to corner her, and cornering someone like Valerie required letting her believe she had room to escape. Near sunset, ironically, the very thing that started the war, Valerie returned home. She stepped onto her deck with renewed irritation, staring at the oak with a kind of simmering hatred. She convinced herself that she had regained control after filing complaints. She believed she had successfully redirected suspicion toward Cole, portraying herself as a victim of his tree and his land. But as she basked in that false sense of victory, she didn't notice the small blinking drone hovering silently behind her home at a distance. It recorded everything: her gestures, her muttered frustrations, her threats whispered under her breath as she stared at the oak. Cole watched it all from his monitor as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Valerie's silhouette was outlined perfectly against the sky she claimed as her own. She had no idea she was being watched. No idea that every move she made had become ammunition. The ridge grew quiet as night approached, but there was a new energy in the air, a shift. The first chapter of the conflict had ended. Valerie had tried and failed to strike first. Now everything depended on her next mistake, and Cole was ready for it. Hunt had begun. Night settled over the valley with a cold, deliberate stillness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The oak tree rose like a dark monument against the moonlit sky, unbroken, unmoved, untouched by Valerie's rage. But beneath its branches, something far more significant had begun to take shape. Cole didn't see the night as darkness, he saw it as cover, a canvas on which truth could be painted with precision. He spent the early hours cataloging everything he had gathered. The footage, the drone clips, the trail maps. Rangers sent markers pinpointing Valerie's exact movements. As he laid the material out across his living room table, it became impossible to ignore the story it told, a story of obsession, trespass, and escalating delusion. Cole understood escalation better than most. In his law enforcement years, he had learned that people like Valerie rarely stopped after a single failed attempt. When entitlement collided with humiliation, the result was almost always retaliation. And Valerie, whose sense of superiority had been bruised by alarms, cameras, and exposure, was now cornered by her own ego, which made her dangerous. As Cole reviewed the footage, something new caught his attention: an unfamiliar vehicle passing by his property earlier that afternoon. A shiny black SUV, tinted windows, moving slowly as if surveying the land. It wasn't a local vehicle. And it certainly wasn't one that belonged in the quiet valley. When Cole zoomed in, he noticed the faint mark of a high-end law firm on the license plate frame. Valerie was preparing to strike again. This time not with an axe but with lawyers. That meant one thing: she believed she still had control. But she didn't. It was time to take the next step, not to confront her, but to tighten the net around her until the only direction left was downward. People who hid behind lies often built those lies in layers. Cole had already peeled back the first, now he needed the rest. As midnight neared, Cole stepped outside into the cool air, Ranger at his side. Crickets sang in the fields and the distant call of an owl echoed across the ridge. He walked to the oak tree, its massive form illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. At its base, he knelt and examined the glove Valerie had dropped in her panic. It wasn't just a glove, it was evidence, a bridge connecting her actions to the crime she tried to hide. The fabric carried the faint scent of her perfume, the same floral arrogance she wore everywhere she went. Cole slipped the glove into a sealed evidence bag with the same care he had used back when gathering proof could mean the difference between justice and failure. Ranger stood guard, ears sharp, watching the shadows with a trained suspicion only years on the force could instill. The dog could sense something shifting, something close, because miles away Valerie was unraveling. Inside her mansion, she paced the length of her living room with restless steps. Her mind had become a storm of fear and denial. Every creak of her house sounded like a threat. Every shift of wind felt like an accusation. Her attempts to convince the county officials had failed to ease her anxiety. Worse, the silence from Cole had become unbearable. People like Valerie needed conflict in order to remain confident. Silence to them was a mirror. And what Valerie saw in that mirror terrified her: the possibility that she was no longer in control. Her fear drove her into impulsive decisions. She made dozens of calls to contractors, lawyers, even a private investigator. She claimed she was being harassed by a neighbor who refused to maintain his hazardous tree. She twisted the narrative with an ease born of privilege. But every lie she voiced put her deeper into the trap Cole was quietly building. Because Cole wasn't preparing for a confrontation, he was preparing for a collapse. He knew that once Valerie's fabricated stories reached enough people, they would begin to conflict. Lies always contradicted each other when spoken in desperation. And Cole was ready to collect every contradiction. Next came the legal traps. Cole drafted a formal complaint not against her but as a request for a safety review of his own property. He documented her trespassing, her attempted vandalism, the glove, the drone footage. He cataloged everything with timestamps and annotations. He submitted it to the county as a proactive homeowner seeking protection. It was a tactical masterstroke, because Valerie's complaints suddenly looked like retaliation, not concern. The county office, already suspicious of her earlier claims, now saw a pattern forming, a dangerous one that pointed directly at her. And while Valerie spent her night drinking away her anxiety and convincing herself that she was the victim, officials were preparing to investigate her instead. Cole watched the process unfold with a calm, steady certainty. He didn't rush, he didn't celebrate. Revenge for him was never emotional. It was structural, a slow pressure on the foundation of another person's lies until the whole thing collapsed under its own weight. But Valerie was not done. Just before dawn, she drove again toward Cole's property. Her headlights cut through the darkness, her engine humming with a quiet determination. She parked just beyond the ridge, stepping out with a flashlight in hand. Paranoia and desperation mixed into something reckless. She approached the oak tree once more. This time she didn't bring an axe. She came to see how much it had moved. She convinced herself the tree had grown overnight, that it was infringing on her land more aggressively than before. She touched the bark, pressed her hand against its rough texture, and whispered frustrations to herself through gritted teeth. She believed the tree was her enemy. What she didn't realize was that Cole's drones were already circling above her, documenting every step she took, every trespass, every moment she touched a tree that didn't belong to her. As she examined the trunk, her flashlight illuminated the newly installed legal notice tied neatly to one of the lower branches, a preservation marker declaring the oak a protected natural heritage landmark. It was official, it was legal, and it was the one thing Valerie could never overcome. She stared at the notice, eyes narrowing, jaw clenching, her anger rising like a tide she could no longer control. She ripped the notice off the tree, crumpling it in her fist. The drone zoomed in, recorded everything, and flew silently back to Cole. Valerie walked away thinking she had removed an obstacle. She didn't realize she had just committed another crime, tampering with a preservation marker. The oak tree stood unshaken, but Valerie's fate had begun to crack. Cole reviewed the new footage with cold precision. The trap was no longer just set, it was primed. One more mistake, one more act of arrogance, and the entire structure of Valerie's lies would collapse. The valley remained quiet, unaware of how close the storm was now. Cole switched off the monitor and stood by his window, watching the first light of morning cast long shadows across the land. Ranger sat beside him, tail still, ears forward. The hunt was no longer simply underway. It was reaching its turning point. Morning rose with a deceptive calm, bathing the valley in soft amber light. Birds moved along the branches of the oak with casual indifference, unaware of the war simmering beneath their feet. But on the ridge above, the storm inside Valerie Stone boiled hotter than the rising sun. Her night had been sleepless, her thoughts buzzing with the agitation of someone who felt reality slipping through her fingers. She ripped the preservation marker from the oak, believing it was nothing more than a piece of red tape. But the moment she returned home, a dread settled into her bones. She knew she had crossed another line, even if she didn't fully understand how deep that line ran. Cole, meanwhile, had already prepared his next move with the discipline of a man who had spent decades analyzing human behavior under pressure. The footage of her tearing down the preservation marker was now the centerpiece of a meticulously organized case file, time-stamped and GPS located by drone data. The valley officials had already agreed to review everything as soon as he brought it in, but Cole wasn't rushing to expose her yet. Revealing the truth too soon would give her room to pivot. He needed her to keep spiraling, because those who believed they were still in control made the most devastating mistakes. By late morning, Valerie had invited two people to her hilltop home, a lawyer from the city and a land surveyor who looked entirely out of place in the rugged countryside. She paced the length of her glass-encased living room as the surveyor marked stakes in the ground, attempting to redraw the property line in a way she believed would give her leverage over the oak tree. Cole watched from afar as the drones hovered discreetly, capturing every movement. The surveyor hesitated as he examined the land. He knew immediately the line couldn't be moved. Boundary markers, deeds, and county records were all against Valerie's claims, but she pressured him with the same force she used on everyone, insisting, demanding, offering payments if he would reconsider the angles. He refused. And the more frustration twisted across her face, the clearer it became that her sense of power was beginning to fracture. Her lawyer wasn't any more reassured. As Valerie attempted to paint herself as the victim of a dangerous, aggressive neighbor, the lawyer's expression shifted from interest to caution. She spoke with a frantic edge she couldn't hide. Her claims contradicted one another, that the tree was dying, that it was growing too fast, that it was a safety hazard, that it was ugly, that it was dangerous, that it was blocking her sunset. Her version of events unraveled under the scrutiny of someone trained to detect lies. The lawyer tried to calm her, but Valerie was beyond calming. She demanded lawsuits. She demanded injunctions. She demanded that Cole be forced to cut the tree down. Every demand was louder, more desperate, more absurd. The lawyer finally left, no longer interested in representing someone who was clearly constructing a house of cards. Cole saw all of it, not through windows or binoculars, but through the recorded patterns of behavior he'd expected from the start. Valerie was losing allies, losing credibility, losing the illusion of control that had held her sanity together. She was becoming exactly what he needed her to be, exposed. As afternoon approached, Cole received a call from the county office. The inspector scheduled to visit Valerie's property had reported her strange complaints and had grown suspicious of her inconsistencies. They asked Cole if he could meet them to discuss ongoing concerns. Cole agreed, but before he left he took one final precaution. He walked to the edge of the ridge where a single camera pointed directly at Valerie's deck. He adjusted its angle slightly, widening the frame. Not to invade her privacy, but to ensure that if she made another reckless move, it would be documented from a perspective she couldn't dispute. Ranger followed him, sitting quietly at his heel. The dog sensed the shift in his owner's energy. There was no satisfaction in Cole's movements, only resolve. The kind of resolve that belonged to someone who didn't seek revenge for pleasure but for balance, and balance was overdue. When Cole arrived at the county office, he laid the evidence out with the calm precision of someone presenting undeniable truth. The officials watched the footage in stunned silence, Valerie trespassing with an axe, triggering alarms, dropping her glove, packing erratically, ripping down the preservation marker, returning repeatedly like a moth drawn to destruction. The oak was proven to be protected. Cole's land was untouched and compliant. Valerie, on the other hand, had crossed multiple legal and civil boundaries. By the end of the meeting, the county had reached a decision. They would issue a cease and desist order. They would initiate an investigation for vandalism and trespassing, and they would require Valerie to attend a formal hearing. Cole didn't smile, but the air thickened with finality. This was the point where the dissent began. The officials asked him one last question. Would you like to press charges? Cole didn't answer immediately. He wasn't a man who made decisions from anger. He considered the facts, the property line, the oak, the community that valued it. He considered her arrogance, her violations, and the danger she posed. Then he nodded once. The valley stirred as Cole left the office, not with gossip but with a quiet knowing that justice was beginning to move. Hours later, when the official truck pulled up to Valerie's mansion, her world split open. She stood frozen on her deck as she was handed the notice. Her face paled, her hands trembled. The carefully constructed fantasy she lived in, where she always won, where she always dictated the rules, cracked under the weight of consequences she never believed would reach her. She tried to argue, she tried to protest, but the officials were immune to her theatrics. They referenced the evidence collected. They referenced the preservation laws. They referenced the trespassing violation. Her voice crumbled. And then, for the first time, she realized there was a force in the valley stronger than her money, the truth. She retreated into her home, shaking, overwhelmed by the weight of losing control. The oak, visible through her glass walls, stood like a judge watching her downfall. Cole returned home as the sun dipped low, its orange glow stretching across the ridge, the very sunset Valerie had tried to steal. Ranger lay beside him on the porch, and the valley exhaled a slow, measured breath. But he knew this wasn't over. People like Valerie didn't collapse quietly, they exploded. And when they did, they became far more dangerous. The night would bring her breaking point. And Cole would need to be ready for whatever came next. Darkness fell like a velvet curtain over the valley, folding the hills and fields into deep shadows. The oak tree towered above the land, an unyielding sentinel, its branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. But beneath its quiet presence, a storm of human chaos was brewing. Valerie Stone, isolated in her glass and steel mansion atop the ridge, felt that storm twisting inside her chest. She was cornered, exposed in ways she could not erase, with no allies left to defend her and no excuses sufficient to shield her from the consequences that were now closing in. Her first instinct was denial. She tried to convince herself that the county's notice was a mistake, that the evidence had been fabricated, that Cole Harrington had somehow manipulated the system. But the evidence was irrefutable. Every movement she had made had been captured, time-stamped, and mapped. Every trespass, every destruction of property, every illegal act was documented with precision that would make a seasoned investigator's heart race with admiration. And that investigator was Cole himself. She roamed the corridors of her mansion like a caged predator, her heels clicking against polished wood, echoes bouncing against walls that offered no comfort. She could no longer see the sunset clearly, obscured now not only by the oak tree, but by the weight of her own recklessness. Her mind raced, and racing minds make mistakes. Cole watched from his own porch, miles below, observing with careful detachment. Ranger lay at his feet, ears twitching at every distant sound, nose alert to the faint scent of the woman who had brought chaos into their valley. Cole didn't need to confront her tonight. He only needed patience, the most powerful weapon in his arsenal. She would act, she always acted, and tonight the valley's darkness would illuminate her undoing. Hours passed. Valerie tried to call allies, lawyers, and friends, but each attempt was met with hesitation or disinterest. Her carefully constructed world of control had dissolved overnight, leaving her vulnerable. Desperation began to seep in like a creeping fog, and desperation, Cole knew, was predictable. At precisely midnight, Valerie made her fateful move. She descended the ridge, navigating her manicured pathways with a flashlight in hand. Her intention was unclear. Some claimed she intended to intimidate, others believed she sought to remove what she believed was still a barrier to her perfect view. Whatever the motive, her movements were reckless, guided by anger and a flawed sense of entitlement. And as always, she was unaware of the eyes and ears that tracked her from every angle. Cole's drones, launched earlier in the evening, hovered silently above the valley, invisible to the untrained eye. Motion sensors, hidden cameras, and tripwires around the oak were active, capturing every footfall, every whispered mutter of frustration, every gesture of her hands as she brushed against the branches. The glove she had left behind weeks before had already linked her definitively to the initial trespass, and now she was compounding the evidence with her midnight excursion. Ranger, already attuned to her scent, padded silently along the edge of the property. His growl was subtle but unmistakable, a low vibration in the shadows, warning both his master and any intruder that the night was no longer hers to control. Valerie reached the base of the oak and paused, her breath forming clouds in the cold night air. The tree, illuminated faintly by the moon, seemed impossibly larger than she remembered. Its limbs stretched wide, as if embracing the valley and daring her to challenge it again. Her flashlight flickered across the bark, exposing scars from the previous attacks, reminders of her failures. And in that moment she made the gravest mistake of all. She touched it again, brushing her hands across its surface, believing she could assert dominance over what had already outlasted generations. The drones captured everything. The motion sensors triggered, flashing lights across the field like lightning. Ranger barked sharply, breaking the tense silence, and Valerie stumbled backward in panic. Her flashlight clattered to the ground, spinning and casting fractured shadows that danced across the oak's massive trunk. The night itself seemed to press in on her, a suffocating weight of accountability she could not escape. Cole, watching from the ridge below, didn't move. He let her panic take its course. Each stumble, each frantic gesture, each panicked glance was recorded, catalogued, and mapped. He understood her psychology as well as he understood the valley. Cornered, she would make mistakes that could not be undone. Valerie's retreat was chaotic. She tripped over rocks, caught herself on low branches, and shouted into the emptiness as if the world owed her an explanation. But the world owed her nothing. The oak, the land, and the law itself had begun their silent reckoning. Finally, she scrambled back up the slope to her mansion, disheveled, frantic, and broken. Her hair was tangled, her clothes dirt-streaked, her mind racing faster than her feet could carry her. Every movement she had made tonight was now evidence, irrefutable proof that she had not only trespassed but had acted with willful disregard for both property and law. Every accusation she had leveled at Cole now hung on her shoulders like an anchor, pulling her into a truth she could no longer deny. By the time she reached the safety of her glass walls, the valley had returned to its quiet calm. Birds settled on the branches of the oak as if nothing had happened. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it the scent of earth, of justice, and of inevitability. Cole reviewed the night's footage again. The night's chaos had provided him with everything he needed: timestamps, GPS tracking, additional proof of trespassing, and new insight into Valerie's unpredictable behavior. He filed the records meticulously, preparing for the formal hearing that would strip her of her claims and expose her arrogance to the community. Ranger rested his head on Cole's knee, the old dog sensing the weight of the moment. The battle was nearing its conclusion, but patience remained the key. The final move belonged to the valley, the law, and the undeniable evidence that had been carefully assembled over weeks of observation. Valerie, on the other hand, sat alone in her mansion. Staring blankly at the oak through her glass walls, she could no longer see it as an obstacle, only as a mirror reflecting every misstep, every lie, every act of hubris that had led her here. The sunset, which had been her prize, continued its descent behind the tree, beautiful, indifferent, and utterly untouchable. And she realized finally that the horizon was no longer hers to command. The night had exposed her, the trap had closed, and the fall was inevitable. Morning arrived with a golden brilliance that seemed almost theatrical, casting long shadows across the valley and illuminating the oak tree that had borne witness to weeks of escalating tension. The tree's branches swayed gently in the wind, as if savoring the calm after a storm, while the fields below remained undisturbed, unclaimed by chaos. But in the glass and steel mansion perched atop the ridge, chaos had found a permanent home. Valerie Stone, once self-assured and untouchable, sat frozen, her reflection fractured against the windows that had so long framed her view. For the first time she felt powerless. Cole Harrington, standing on his porch below, surveyed the valley with a quiet intensity. The hours of surveillance, planning, and patience had led to this moment. He didn't feel triumph, he felt inevitability. Justice had been woven quietly and methodically into the very land she had tried to dominate. Now it only needed the world to see what the evidence had long told him. Valerie had overstepped, underestimated, and failed. The county hearing was scheduled for mid-morning. Cole arrived with Ranger at his side, the dog's posture a mixture of alertness and calm discipline. The oak tree loomed in the background, its trunk steady and proud, a silent testament to endurance and protection. Officials, neighbors, and a few curious onlookers gathered, sensing the tension in the valley but unaware of the precise depth of the drama they were about to witness. When the proceedings began, the case unfolded with cinematic clarity. Cole presented every piece of evidence: the trail cameras capturing her midnight excursion, the glove abandoned beneath the oak, the drone footage mapping her movements, timestamps, and GPS coordinates, and finally the documentation of her destruction of the preservation marker. Each exhibit layered upon the next, forming an unassailable narrative. Every accusation Valerie had leveled against him crumbled under the weight of factual precision. Every attempt to manipulate perception, to claim victimhood, dissolved in the light of undeniable truth. Valerie's initial defiance faltered quickly. She attempted to interject, to explain away her trespassing, to frame her actions as a passionate defense of her view, but her arguments collided with the unrelenting evidence. Officials asked pointed questions, each answer revealing inconsistencies, exaggerations, and fabrications. Her arrogance, once a shield, now functioned as a magnifying lens exposing every flaw. The valley's eyes watched as the narrative shifted. She was no longer the seeker of justice, she was the perpetrator, caught in the mirror of her own hubris. The community felt the weight of the transformation. Neighbors who had tolerated her presence or silently feared her influence now saw clearly the pattern of entitlement and aggression. They murmured among themselves, whispering about how the mighty could fall when they believed rules applied only to others. The oak, patient and stoic, seemed to observe these events without judgment, its branches stretching wide as if absorbing the lessons carved into the land and its people. Cole remained composed throughout the hearing. There was no gloating in his posture, no visible satisfaction. He understood the significance of restraint. True power lay not in confrontation but in preparation and measured execution. By letting the evidence speak, by allowing Valerie to reveal her own downfall, he had demonstrated a mastery of justice that required no force beyond truth. By midday, the hearing reached its inevitable conclusion. The county issued orders to prevent further harassment, established clear boundaries protecting the oak, and warned Valerie that any future trespass or destruction would result in fines, legal action, and possible criminal charges. The preservation of the tree was reaffirmed, and Cole's rights as a property owner were reinforced. Every attempt Valerie had made to control the narrative had failed, undone by her own actions and by the careful patience of the man she underestimated. Exiting the hearing, Cole felt a rare sense of closure. The valley seemed lighter, the air sharper, as though the land itself exhaled. Ranger walked faithfully at his side, his gaze steady, his presence a reminder that loyalty and vigilance could shape outcomes as decisively as laws or cameras. Together they returned to the property, to the oak, to the rhythm of life uninterrupted by those who sought to dominate without understanding. Valerie returned to her mansion alone, aware of her isolation in a way she had never experienced before. The view she had fought so desperately to claim remained obscured not by trees, not by law, but by the consequences of her own choices. Each reflective surface in her home mirrored back her anxiety, her defeat, and the finality of her loss. She had believed she could bend the world to her desires, but the valley, the oak, and the truth proved otherwise. Cole watched the sunset from his porch, Ranger resting at his feet, the golden light spreading across the valley like a benediction. The oak stood firm, its centuries-old strength undiminished by human arrogance. The battle for control, the struggle over perspective and pride, had been fought with intelligence, patience, and preparation, not brute force. The sunset she had sought to possess remained hers only in memory, but for Cole, it was a reminder that justice, once executed with precision, was the most beautiful view of all. As night fell, the valley returned to its quiet rhythm. Crickets sang, the wind rustled through the oak's branches, and the moonlight painted silver patterns on the fields below. Cole and Ranger moved through the property, checking sensors and cameras one last time, ensuring that the land and its guardian remained secure. Peace had returned, not through fear or aggression, but through methodical vigilance, preparation, and the understanding that true power lies in the ability to protect what is sacred. Valerie's chapter in the valley had ended, not with a dramatic confrontation or a last-minute escape, but with the slow unraveling of control, the exposure of lies, and the imposition of consequence. She had tried to dominate, to manipulate, to assert her will upon a world that would not bend. And she had failed spectacularly. Cole, meanwhile, remained unchanged. The oak stood behind him, the sunset behind it, the valley stretching beyond. Justice had been served not for satisfaction, but for balance, a restoration of order in a place where patience, wisdom, and steadfastness outweighed wealth, arrogance, and entitlement. The valley, the tree, and its people had endured, and the lesson was clear: power that seeks to dominate without understanding will always be tempered by truth. As the final light of the sun disappeared behind the western ridge, Cole turned to Ranger, placing a hand on the dog's head. Together, they looked out over the valley, unshaken, unbroken, and ready for whatever challenge might come next. The oak swayed gently in the evening breeze, a quiet guardian of the land and a silent witness to the fall of the woman who had sought to claim what was never hers. And in that golden twilight, the valley knew that some things, patience, wisdom, and justice, were eternal.